that it should be thrown in a trash can, and the world would be better off without it. Religion lives through fear. Religion lives through making people dependent upon something outside of themselves. Religion lives through authoritarian brutalities, psychological brutalities, and this is what keeps religion alive.
What do you have against God? Why does he bug you?
Well, first off, there isn't any, and second off, the idea which you invented has caused more misery to every human being in all ages of history than any other single idea.
Is it lonely being an atheist?
It's lonely being intelligent. I think that's primarily it.
That was Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She was once named the most hated woman in America, and that clip was recorded just a few years before she was kidnapped and murdered. Lawyer, atheist, activist, her activism took her all the way to the Supreme Court in a decision that had a hand in the eventual breakdown of the separation between church and state and the far-right hellscape we live in today. This is the story of Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the most hated woman in America who you've probably never heard about. Roll the intro. Thank you to my partner on today's video, Warby Parker. I love my Warby Parker glasses. I have a ton of different pairs of them. I've been wearing them for years, and that's why I work with them all the time, because I love Warby Parker glasses. And now I am actually on the hunt for some more. So I ordered a free at-home try-on kit. That's right, you can go to warbyparker.com/Leeja and order a free at-home try-on kit. You get 5 glasses to try on for free at home, no obligation to buy. It comes in this box with a prepaid shipping label so that you can easily return it. I'm on the hunt for some clear glasses, or some smoky clear glasses. So right now I'm debating between a couple. This pair, this is the Drew Wide in Rose Water. Ooh, this color scheme, forget about it. I'm also a fan of the Durand Extra Wide, also in Rose Water. These feel a little bit nerdier, but in a fun way. And then we have the Jillian Wide in Nutmeg Crystal. Also love this color. Much to think about. What do you think? And what's cool is that Warby Parker doesn't just do eyeglasses. They also do sunglasses and contact lenses and eye exams at one of their 190 different retail locations. And glasses start at just $95, including the lenses. You can also get blue light filtering lenses, which I love because it helps keep glare off of my glasses and helps with my headaches. So if you're interested in checking out Warby Parker, I highly recommend it. Go to warbyparker.com/Leeja to order your free at-home try-on kit today. Thanks, Warby Parker. The Supreme Court case that would catapult Madalyn into infamy started as a protest by a young lawyer who had found atheism early in her life. Madalyn Murray O'Hair was born April 13th, 1919. She was an Aries, which will become very apparent as the story unfolds. Yes, I'm a lawyer who likes to talk about astrology, get over it. She grew up in an upper middle class family in Pittsburgh, but when the stock market crashed in 1929 when she was just 10, her family lost everything and remained impoverished for the remainder of Madalyn's teenage years. She says she read the Bible cover to cover when she was 13 and cites that reading as the moment when she lost faith, despite being raised Presbyterian in a time when being religious was a foregone conclusion. Over 95% of Americans identified as Christian during the 1930s. Not Madalyn. She reported being, and I quote, horrified, I mean really horrified, by the contents of the Bible. You talk about sadomasochism and abuse and murderous stories and improbable history. From that time forward, I began to study, research, question, because the term atheist was nearly taboo in this country. It was years before I could find a label for where I stood. In 1941, at 22 years old, Madalyn married a steelworker, but they separated soon after when she joined the war effort, working in the Women's Army Corps as a cryptographer in Africa and Italy. During that time, she had an affair with a married man named William J. Murray. They had a son, whom she named William J. Murray III, or Bill Murray. Not that one, though. She also took the last name Murray, though she never married William Murray, because he refused to divorce his wife as it was against his religion. Madalyn went on to earn a bachelor's degree from Ashland College in Ohio in 1948, and a law degree from South Texas College in 1952. She went on to study social work at Howard University, and worked as a social worker for a variety of public welfare agencies. In 1954, she had a second son, John Garth Murray. I didn't find any information about who the father was, but they were never married. In fact, a lot of the information about Madalyn's life is a bit wishy-washy. She was extremely private, saying that her personal life was nobody's business. So all the years and facts I just mentioned, I don't know, take them with a grain of salt. What we do know for sure is that during this whole time, her interest in atheism and her atheist belief system was solidifying, especially with each experience she had with religion. Whether it was a man who got her pregnant but wouldn't leave his wife because of his religion, to her experience being an unwed mother in a society that viewed that as the ultimate sin. In 1945, while pregnant with her first son, she was so adamant about there not being a God that she ran out into a lightning storm and screamed at God to smite her. She walked away unharmed. So by the 1960s, now in her 40s, Madeline was a staunch and vocal atheist, raising her sons in that belief system as well. She was also briefly a socialist and attended Socialist Workers' Party meetings post-World War II at a time when that would get you fired from most jobs, and that's by all accounts what happened. In fact, in 1959 and 1960, she attempted to defect to the Soviet Union with her sons, but the country denied them citizenship. So she traveled back to the United States and landed in Baltimore in 1960, getting work as a social worker and enrolling her sons in the local school district. She soon found out that her older son, William, who was 14 at the time, was required to say daily group prayers at his junior high school. She complained to the school, who said that her son was required to say the prayer or read a Bible verse. After that, she began her crusade against prayer in public school by suing the Baltimore School District for violating her child's First Amendment rights. Regarding freedom of religion, the First Amendment says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Together, those are known as the Establishment Clause, Congress can't establish a religion, and the Free Exercise Clause, Congress can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. However, there were strong historical precedents for the recitation of prayers and use of religious texts in publicly funded schools in America. Horace Mann, considered the father of the modern public school system, I talked about him in my video about how conservatives are sabotaging public schools. In the 1840s, he argued that the Bible should be a foundational text for students, noting in a report from 1844 that out of 308 towns in Massachusetts, only 3 did not generally use the Bible in their schools. By the 1960s, however, the Supreme Court had officially recognized the idea of the separation between church and state. The separation of church and state, contrary to popular belief, appears nowhere in the Constitution. As I said, the First Amendment guarantees the free exercise of religion and that the government would not establish an official religion, but it doesn't explicitly say there must be separation of church and state. This idea comes from Thomas Jefferson, who interpreted the Free Exercise Clause to guarantee a wall of separation between church and state. The fact that Jefferson, one of the framers of the Constitution, wrote these words is strong evidence that the intent of the Constitution was to create separation between the church and the state, but it's not explicitly written into the Constitution. In 1947, in Everson v. Board of Education, Justice Hugo Black wrote, "The Establishment of Religion Clause in the First Amendment means at least this: neither a state nor the federal government may set up a church. Neither can pass laws that aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force a person to go to or to remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion." In the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. Notice in that language that Hugo Black said, neither can force a person to go to church against his will or force him to profess a belief in any religion. This is what Madeline was going off of when she fought for not a freedom of religion, but a freedom from religion. The regulations of the Baltimore School Board, where Madeline's son attended school, stated each school, either collectively or in classes, shall be opened by the reading without comment of a chapter in the Holy Bible and or the use of the Lord's Prayer. Madeline's initial lawsuit got the Attorney General of Maryland to issue a finding that school prayer and Bible reading were constitutional, but that the students should be allowed to excuse themselves. To Madeline, this wasn't enough. This wasn't about her son's ability to decline. It's about the fact that a public school has a regular prayer recitation at all, considering the so-called separation of church and state, so she filed another lawsuit. This lawsuit against the school was dismissed by the district court, so she appealed that thing all the way up to the top, where it was combined by the Supreme Court with another case and renamed to School District of Abington Township, Pennsylvania versus Schempp. Similarly to Maryland, in Pennsylvania, public schools were required to read from the Bible at the beginning of each school day. In that case, however, the district court ruled that that requirement was a violation of the First Amendment. And so, because one court dismissed the case as without merit and another found that it was against the First Amendment, there was a circuit split that required input from the Supreme Court to make a final decision. Oral arguments were heard in February of 1963 with a final decision in June of the same year. In an 8-1 decision, the court found in favor of Madeline's case, saying that public schools can't sponsor Bible readings and recitations of the Lord's Prayer because it violated the First Amendment Establishment Clause. By requiring the reading of the Bible, a Christian document, it's clear that the school prefers the Christian religion, and it's clear that the intention of the state or school board was to introduce a Christian religious ceremony in the public public schools. And there are a couple of passages in this opinion that I want to read to you because they ring somehow even more true today, 60 years later, in a country where the Christian right claims that they are being persecuted at every level by not being able to impose their religion upon our government and state institutions. Here are a couple helpful quotes for those people. The Establishment Clause has been directly considered by this court 8 times in the past score of years, and it has consistently held that the clause withdrew all legislative power respecting religious belief or the expression thereof. The test may be stated as follows. What are the purpose and the primary effect of the enactment? If either is the advancement or inhibition of religion, then the enactment exceeds the scope of legislative power as circumscribed by the Constitution. That is to say that to withstand the strictures of the Establishment Clause, there must be a secular legislative purpose and a primary effect that neither advances nor inhibits religion. Okay, so they laid out a 2-part test to determine whether a law violates the Establishment Clause. The law must have a secular legislative purpose, meaning a non-religious purpose, and the effect of the law must neither advance nor inhibit religion. If the purpose is religion, or the effect advances or inhibits the practice of religion, then it's against the First Amendment. This is why, for example, so many states that are banning trans-affirming care are focused on the supposed harm that it causes the child, because they can point to that as their secular purpose. It's definitely not they're imposing their religious belief on these people. It's definitely out of concern for the child. This despite the fact that what they use to prove that it's damaging to children is anecdotal evidence and studies that contravene what the majority of the medical community says, but I digress. The court goes on to say that even minor violations of someone's First Amendment right against government imposition of a religion are not okay. And the court's words are prescient. The court says, it is no defense to urge that the religious practices here may be relatively minor encroachments on the First Amendment. The breach of neutrality that is today a trickling stream may all too soon become a raging torrent. And in the words of Madison, it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. And yeah, I think we've reached raging torrent stage at this point in 2023. Finally, the court says that requiring the state to remain neutral is also not a violation of someone's religious liberty, saying we cannot accept that the concept of neutrality, which does not permit a state to require a religious exercise even with the consent of the majority of those affected, collides with the majority's right to free exercise of religion. While the Free Exercise Clause clearly prohibits the use of state action to deny the rights of free exercise to anyone, it has never meant that a majority could use the machinery of the state to practice its beliefs. Interesting. Anyway, so the court found in Madalyn Murray O'Hair's favor, which was a huge victory for her and a huge blow to the religious right. This was one of a series of blows throughout the 1960s against the imposition of religion in the classroom. As we discussed in my video titled How the Religious Right Ruined Everything, this series of Supreme Court blows in the 1960s, including further bans on prayer in schools, bans on financial assistance to religious schools, and bans on laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution in the classroom, were a galvanizing force for the growth of the religious right in the 1970s, culminating in the creation of the moral majority and the election of Ronald Reagan, who, as we discussed in another one of my videos, ruined everything. For her part, Madalyn had gained quite a bit of notoriety as this case played out in the courts, wielding the media to draw attention to her atheist cause. Her win at the Supreme Court catapulted her to national fame. She appeared on the very first episode of Phil Donahue's talk show in 1963, mere months after the decision came down, and fervently discussed her atheist beliefs. Many more controversial talk show and magazine appearances would follow in the years to come.
Organized religion and traditional religion is dead. Not alone their God is dead, but everything else is a rotting corpse. It's this simply because it is not relevant to what is going on.
You want to exercise your insanity in public, and you want everybody who is a captive audience in that public to participate in it by listening to you do it. Now, you completely ignore the admonitions of Jesus Christ, and you presume to be a Christian. He said, do not pray in public.
Oh my God, young man.
Why did you just now say, oh my God?
Because it hacks the Christians. I use it all the time.
While her efforts grew public attention, death threats, and hate mail, her notoriety seemed to suit her well. Madalyn is quoted as saying that she loves a good fight. She swore like a sailor, and she took every opportunity to make inflammatory anti-Christian statements on national television. When asked her favorite pastime, she said it was thinking and beer drinking. She considered herself an anarchist, and an integrationist, and an internationalist, and all the other ists that people seem to find so horrible these days. ways. I embrace all of them. She considered profanity and using four-letter words as a means of exercising her First Amendment rights, as she was against obscenity laws. Obscenity began being policed in earnest starting with the Comstock Act in the late 1800s by Anthony Comstock, a devout Christian who was appalled by the sinful activity in America's growing cities. Our obscenity laws stem from him, and as such, at least according to Madeline, are another example of the church having far too much sway over the state. Madeline was also an avid writer. In 1965, she founded the American Atheist Press because other publishers wouldn't touch her writing. She also started receiving an outpouring of support and donations from those who believed in her cause. Shortly after the Supreme Court's 1963 decision that catapulted her into fame, she received a $5,000 check from a nudist wheat farmer in Kansas. And that was the first in a slew of money that was sent her way from supporters and from her numerous speaking engagements. Using this money, she was able to enrich herself and also founded the American Atheist Center in Austin, Texas, an organization whose mission was to defend the civil rights of non-believers, work for the separation of church and state, and address issues of First Amendment public policy. With this group, she was able to take on a number of other atheist crusades, none of which proved as successful as her 1963 Supreme Court case. She attempted to get In God We Trust removed from U.S. money. In case you didn't know, In God We Trust was added to our money in the middle of the 1900s after World War II because godliness was seen as the furthest thing possible from communism. So it hadn't been on there that long when Madalyn Murray O'Hair began fighting to get it removed. She also challenged the tax-exempt status of churches as government support of religion. She sued NASA for its televised broadcast of Apollo 8 astronauts becoming the first humans to orbit the moon. The astronauts marked the event during a Christmas Eve broadcast by reading a few verses from the book of Genesis.
And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
She also tried to get God removed from the Pledge of Allegiance. She hosted a popular radio talk show that ran on 150 radio stations across the country. She continued to make public appearances throughout the 1960s and 70s. In 1964, Time magazine dubbed her the most hated woman in America, which she seemed to enjoy. She also was an ardent feminist and penned articles for Playboy and Hustler, a sex worker ally before that was a thing. During this time, she also wrote 11 books. And all of this activity, despite a string of failed lawsuits, appeared to be very lucrative. Madeline made a lot of personal wealth through her many speaking engagements, and the American Atheist Center received millions in donations, with estimates that at its peak it controlled $15 million in donated assets, including real estate, offshore bank accounts, and an atheist library worth $3 million. Publisher of Hustler magazine, Larry Flynt, was an ardent supporter, at one point signing over his entire $300 million fortune in his will until his brother got a judge to block the bequest. Flynt even ran for president in 1984 and had Madeline write his speeches. During this time, Madeline became estranged from her oldest son, William. Remember Bill Murray? He had a ballooning drug and alcohol problem, to the point that Madeline actually adopted his daughter Robin to protect her from his abuse. Then, as many addicts have done before him, William found God. William, the poster child for the atheist movement in the 1960s, became a fervent, born-again Christian. He denounced his mother and wrote numerous books about being raised by an atheist and all of the things wrong with atheism in America. He's now a Baptist minister and chairman of the Religious Freedom Coalition, a right-wing Washington, D.C. lobbying group. In 1995, he wrote a book called Let Us Pray, A Plea for Prayer in Our Schools. Like, this man did a full 180. And Madeline disowned him. Her other son, John Garth, and her now adopted granddaughter, Robin, both worked for the American Atheist Center and believed strongly in Madeline's cause. In 1986, at the age of 67, Madeline resigned as president of the American Atheist Center and named her son John Garth as her successor. He would continue to run the center with the help of Robin, but Madeline also continued to have a hand in the inner workings of the organization as well. And she continued to be ahead of her times, saying in an interview in 1989 that there's an absolute steady retreat into what I call neo-fascism, but it's really old-time fascism, into a robber baron society and a religiously dominated society. And that's not cyclical because they have new weapons at hand now, mainly communications technology with which they can rapidly disperse ideas. Sound familiar? She said that in 1989. Woof. Madeline continued to be involved in the American Atheist Center into her retirement, writing for the magazine, doing radio and television interviews, and continuing to mentor her son and granddaughter, who all lived together in their Austin, Texas home. Then, in late August 1995, Madeline Murray O'Hair, her son John Garth, and her granddaughter Robin vanished. The only sign of their whereabouts was a hastily written note left on the door of the American Atheist office saying they had been called away on an emergency. The office received a couple calls from the trio, calls that were described as cagey, as none of the group group would indicate where they were or when they'd be back. After one such call on September 28, 1995, the three were never heard from again. The disappearance made national headlines as many speculated what could have been the reason for the three to skip town together. Some speculated that they used the funds in an offshore account in New Zealand to travel somewhere remotely and live off their riches. Others speculated that Madeline was close to death and had decided to go somewhere remote to die in peace, away from the possibility that anyone might pray over her body or bury her in a religious ceremony, which was against her wishes. She wrote in the American Atheist magazine 1 decade before her disappearance, "I have told John and Robin that when I die, they should gather me up in a sheet, unwashed, drag or carry me out and put me on a pyre in the backyard and burn my carcass." Iconic. Still others wondered whether there was foul play, considering the number of enemies Madeline and her family had gained over the decades. A few weeks after their disappearance, $600,000 in American Atheist organization money disappeared from their bank accounts. On September 29, 1995, John Garth reportedly picked up $500,000 worth of gold coins at a San Antonio jewelry store. That was the last time any of the three were seen. It took a year and a half for a missing persons report to be filed for the three, and it was filed by none other than Madeline's evangelical Christian son William. While many had assumed the three ran off together with the money, William believed foul play was afoot. Even with the missing persons report filed, the police found no evidence of what happened to the three O'Hares. In 1996, a reporter started digging through the evidence. First the $600,000 withdrawal, then John Garth's phone records. In 1998, that reporter received a phone call from someone who said they knew that Madeline, John, and Robin disappeared not of their own volition, but because of a kidnapping. And the tipster gave the reporter a name, David Waters. The tipster said he was a friend of a person concerned with the welfare of a man named Danny Fry. David Waters had convinced Danny to help with a kidnapping, and he had been missing ever since. After some digging, the journalist discovered the connection between David Waters and Madeline Murray O'Hair. David had been employed by the American Atheist Center in 1993, where he worked as an office manager. He was soon fired after he was caught stealing upwards of $53,000 from the organization. David Waters also had a violent criminal record, including a murder conviction when he was a teenager, and had spent the majority of his life in prison. Madeline had a habit of hiring ex-convicts to work for her. Madeline also had a habit of being particularly blunt and aggressive. After she fired Waters, she wrote a scathing article about him in the American Atheist newsletter, disclosing his past crimes and making comments about his sexuality. This made Waters obviously pretty angry. He also knew, because of his time at the office, that the American Atheist Center had considerable amounts of money, and Madeline had access to that money. By the time the reporter made all these connections in 1999, the FBI became involved, leading to the arrest of David Waters and another man, Gary Carr, in connection to the case. While in custody, David Waters agreed to talk to investigators in exchange for a lighter sentence. His 2001 confession led the authorities to a remote ranch outside of San Antonio, where investigators dug up the dismembered remains of Madeline Murray O'Hair, her son John Garth Murray, and her granddaughter Robin Murray O'Hair. The dismembered head and hands of a fourth person, eventually identified as Danny Fry, the tipster's friend, were also found in the gravesite. His body had actually been discovered 6 years earlier along the banks of a river in Dallas. Without the head and the hands, the body was never identified. David Waters received a 20-year sentence for the murders. At the time of his sentencing, he was already serving a 60-year state sentence for probation violations and an 8-year federal sentence for weapons violations. He would only serve 2 of those years, however, dying of lung cancer in prison in 2003. The other man, Gary Carr, was sentenced to prison in connection with the kidnapping and murders and is still in prison today. After David Waters' death, in response to a Freedom of Information Act request from the San Antonio Express-News, the FBI produced a 321-page transcript of interviews with David Waters in which he confessed to the crime and laid out the details of the month-long kidnapping. Over 4 days, the investigators prodded Waters for information about what happened to the O'Hares, as well as Danny Fry. According to that testimony, here's what happened. After months of planning, the kidnapping plot was launched on August 27, 1995, when Waters, Carr, and Fry, armed with handguns, surprised Madeline, John, and Robin at the Atheist headquarters on a Sunday afternoon. They then took all three to the family's Austin home. After gathering medicine and supplies, the group waited for dark. Once night fell, the group left in a rented van, driving along Interstate 35 to a truck stop motel in Buda, Texas. The next day, they drove to San Antonio and rented a 2-bedroom suite at the Warren Inn. The O'Hares were told they would be let go unharmed if they gave the men $1 million from the overseas accounts of the American Atheist Organization. Waters described Carr as a loose cannon, saying the O'Hares were terrified of him, and Waters had to keep an eye on Carr so he didn't lose it and ruin the whole plan. Danny Fry, on the other hand, was a liability to Waters. For example, one morning, Waters found Danny Fry asleep with his pistol on the kitchen table across the room from him. He considered Danny absent-minded, a security risk. Now, reminder, this is the 1990s, so wiring a fuck ton of money took time. So over the course of a month, from late August to late September 1995, this group of 6 holed up in that Warren Inn, occasionally leaving for pizza and beers, but generally just hanging out in this weird limbo, playing cards and video games, watching movies, having intellectual debates. Eventually, the funds from New Zealand made their way to an American atheist bank account in New Jersey. On September 21st, Carr and John Garth flew to New Jersey to arrange a transfer of the funds from the bank account to another account in San Antonio to then be used to buy gold coins, chosen because they're not traceable. On that New Jersey trip, there were instances when John Garth could have escaped or notified authorities, but he didn't. The theory being that he was intimidated by his captors and worried that if he messed something up in New Jersey, his mother and niece would be killed in Texas. But again, this was 1995, information didn't travel that fast, I don't know. It remains a mystery why John Garth didn't ask for help, say, when he was sent into the New Jersey bank to transfer the money alone. David Waters himself admitted that if John had said something, asked for help, the whole group would have had to have flown the coop. Again, back in San Antonio, John was sent to pick up the money that had been transferred from New Jersey. Again, he was alone and could have asked for help. He could have run with the money, but he didn't. He delivered the gold to his captors. And once they had the gold, they no longer had a need for the 𝗖𝗓𝗧. The 3 were moved to a third motel in San Antonio, La Quinta Inn, to a ground room floor. Waters later said that the move was made so that it would be easier to remove the bodies discreetly. And on September 29th, 1995, all 3 were tied at their hands and feet and strangled one by one. Once night fell, their bodies were rolled up in bedspreads and loaded into the back of the rented cargo van. They were then taken to a rented storage unit in Austin, where Carr dismembered the bodies and loaded them into 3 55-gallon metal drums. They drove those barrels to a ranch in a remote area outside San Antonio, where they were buried, along with Danny Fry's head and hands. Waters admitted to killing Danny Fry, though the details of his murder are less clear. He died sometime after the 𝗖𝗓𝗧, but before they were driven to the remote ranch and buried. Carr again dismembered Danny on the bank of that river outside Dallas, leaving his body there to be found a few days later by passers-by. A few days after the killing, Danny's brother Bob called from Florida, asking where Danny was. Waters and Carr made a special trip to Bob's house, threatening him and telling him to keep quiet. Bob kept his end of the bargain for 3 years, until 1998, when he called the reporter investigating the disappearances as an anonymous tipster, and told him about his brother's disappearance in San Antonio at the same time the 𝗖𝗓𝗧 vanished, saying he knew it was David Waters who had done the kidnapping. That tip eventually led to the arrests of Waters and Carr, and in 2000, before the bodies were found, Carr was convicted of numerous crimes related to robbery and crossing state lines with stolen property. He was acquitted of kidnapping, but found guilty on the other counts, receiving life sentences for each. Because the bodies had not been found at the time of his trial, the evidence of kidnapping was weak, and there was no body, so no murder trial could take place. As I said, Gary Carr continues to serve his prison sentence today. The gold coins Waters and Carr extorted from their victims? Well, a few days after the murders, they were placed in a suitcase and stashed in a storage locker in San Antonio. 1 week later, 3 kids broke into the storage facility and stole the suitcase, blowing the gold coins on strippers, guns, and cars. Despite being remembered for her untimely and gruesome death, Madalyn Murray O'Hair remains one of the most influential figures in the crusade to enforce a separation between the church and the state in the United States. Her rise to prominence followed the end of the Second World War, when a growth in tensions between the US and the Soviet Union created a Cold War wherein American propaganda sought to instill fear of the threat of communism into the hearts of Americans. They did this most successfully by allying Christianity with Americanism, and atheism with amorality and communism. This link between atheism and communism pushed many people towards religion and was a principal narrative when Madalyn took the scene in the 1960s. Her work, though often unsuccessful in immediate outcomes, made a tangible difference in disconnecting atheism from communism and giving non-believers a model and an alternative to the fervent Christianity of the 50s and 60s. Her work aligned with the counterculture movement of the 70s. It means that today, in many parts of the country at least, you can identify as an atheist and it doesn't come with a heavy load of baggage and assumptions. There are, of course, many criticisms to be made of Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Many even in her circle found her to be so off-putting that they worried she would scare people away from the atheist cause. Her tirade against David Waters, though he clearly was an awful person, wherein she called his sexuality into question and shamed him for his past crimes, indicates a lack of compassion for the formerly incarcerated people she hired to work for her. She once wrote an article that made it seem like maybe she was a Holocaust denier, which is bad and wrong, to be clear. She was forcefully dreadfully opinionated in a way that probably made it hard to have a conversation with her. She was a know-it-all. She was incredibly arrogant, as evidenced by numerous quotes such as, "Compared to most cud-chewing, small-talking, stupid American women, I'm a brain," and "We might as well admit it, I'm a genius." She seemed to incredibly enjoy the limelight, and she did questionable things with her money and the money she collected on behalf of the American Atheist Center, leading to multiple investigations by the IRS. She was an incredibly flawed and imperfect person. Despite these valid criticisms, Madalyn Murray O'Hair and her work to enforce a separation between church and state are also still incredibly pertinent in the United States today, where the religious right has a death grip on large swaths of the Republican Party, and where an armed insurrection was seen by many participants as the will of God in favor of a president who they saw as akin to Jesus Christ himself. But while atheism is no longer tied to communism and is openly practiced, especially in many liberal and urban circles, the disdain for atheists has not gone away. A 2011 Pew Research poll found that for most people surveyed, atheists were approximately as trustworthy as rapists were, and our government and its leaders continue to be incredibly religious and Christian. In 2011, then Republican presidential candidate Newt Gingrich was asked in a primary debate in Des Moines, Iowa, whether he thought an atheist could ever become president. His response? No. If you said to me that we were electing somebody who believed that they by themselves were strong enough to be president of the United States, I would tell you that person terrifies me because they completely misunderstand how weak and how limited any human being is. Asked a similar question a month later, he answered, "How can you have judgment if you have no faith? How can I trust you with power if you don't pray?" His answers were met with resounding applause. In the last 15 years, the share of Christians in the general U.S. population has dropped from 78% to 63%. Nearly 30% of U.S. adults say they are religiously unaffiliated, either atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, a percentage that has nearly doubled in the last 15 years. And yet our Congress does not accurately reflect these changes. 88% of the members in the 118th Congress identify as Christian, nearly 9 in 10. That's only a few percentage points lower than the Christian share of Congress in the 1970s. In 1979, 91% of members of Congress identified as Christian. As in many, many other cases, our congressional representatives do not actually represent us in these numbers. This probably also has something to do with the fact that our Congress is made up of incredibly white and incredibly old people. 75% are white, compared to 59% of the US population. The average age of a Congress member is 58, compared to the US median of 38. So yeah, older, whiter people do tend to be more Christian. And that also means that Christianity infiltrates its way into our government more easily because of the leaders who are conditioned to support it. And the Supreme Court is following suit. In 2022, it heard 2 cases, Carson v. Macon and Kennedy v. Bremerton School District, that undid the work of Madalyn Murray and others who have fought to keep religion out of public schools. In Carson, the court found that Maine was required to fund religious activity as part of its educational aid program and could not prohibit the use of public funds to finance religious instruction. The court's 6 conservative justices disregarded decades of precedent in coming to this conclusion. And in Kennedy, the court ruled in favor of a Christian man who worked as a football coach at a public school who prayed with his players while on duty, ignoring a long-standing precedent that prohibits school officials from participating in prayer with students. In her dissent in Carson, Justice Sonia Sotomayor laid out how the majority's rulings in Carson and Kennedy lead us to a place where separation of church and state becomes a constitutional violation. Not to mention the numerous times when the court has sided with those who, in the name of their religion, discriminate against customers, employees, and recipients of government-funded social services, most recently finding in 303 Creative v. Ellis that the First Amendment protects a woman's right to discriminate based on her religion. And so, in 2023, Madalyn Murray O'Hair's fight is still as relevant as ever, and her words from 1989 ring truer than they ever have. There is an absolute steady retreat into a robber baron society and a religiously dominated society. They have new weapons at hand now, mainly communications technology with which they can rapidly disperse ideas. And if you like this video, you might also like my video about why conservatives fall for fake news. Very related. And hey, if you didn't know, my work in bringing you these videos week after week, which collectively take about 25 to 30 hours each to make, is supported in part through my Patreon, where I do weekly chats on our private Discord server, book giveaways, early access to videos, access to my research notes, and monthly Ask Me Anything style live streams just for Patreon supporters. If you like what you've been watching and any of that sounds good to you, I encourage you to come on over to Patreon today. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, and Brett Piantek. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.